This is the Deliberate Talks Weekly Podcast, powered by the Pixelated Egg Digital Ventures. Tune in every week to learn something new about digital marketing and entrepreneurship. And now, over to the voice of your host, Dakshin Adyanthaya. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and you have tuned into a show in the new age of audio. Actually, that's what our conversation today is all about. But this is the Deliberate Talks podcast, and I'm your host, Dakshin Adyanthaya. And before we get into inviting Graham to enlighten us about the world of audio, here are some quick stats about it. Did you know that users spend an average of 11 to 22 hours on Clubhouse? And Podcast Insight highlights 49% of podcast listeners tune in from home, while 22% of them listen to shows in their cars. Also, 61% of businesses are planning to increase their digital audio advertising budgets. And now, let's head straight into a dialogue with our guest today. He is the founder of Pickle & Co., an award-winning podcast agency based out of Singapore. Apart from being a published author, he also is the host of Podcast Maps, the Be More Human podcast, the Excel podcast, and Asia Tech podcast. Here's introducing Graham Brown. Hello, Graham. How are you doing? Welcome to the Deliberate Talks podcast.
I'm good. Thank you, Dakshin. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Graham, your journey has been nothing short of a podcast show in itself. You're a founder of a company, author, podcaster, sold your business and traveled the world. Keen on knowing, firstly, how did you start your journey of podcasting? And tell me about that first experience when you recorded your first A-list podcast with the CEO of AirAsia, Tony Fernandez.
So when it comes to podcasting, I've been in communications for the best part of 20 years, Dakshin, helping initially telecoms companies in the communications industry tell their stories, helping them on their communications and marketing strategies way back to 2000 in the early days of mobile technology. Obviously, we didn't have podcasts back then. It was 2005 before podcasts were a thing and included on the old iTunes desktop app. But nobody was really doing it back then. I started initially recording phone calls for research with executives in the telecoms industry, but there wasn't any sort of hosting platform of note back then. So I was recording these effectively what were podcasts, but in those days you would have this gadget which you would, almost like a wiretap, put into a mobile phone in the desktop phones of old, and record an analog phone call with somebody in a different country. That's how I got started. And it really wasn't till years later that I discovered that they had made that a whole lot easier with podcasting.
Right.
And all the way up to the present day where I run a podcast agency. I've been doing in different formats for 20 odd years, but only the last 4 months I've really been doing it for other people and helping these companies start their podcasts.
Right. And how was your experience, like I asked? That very first episode that you recorded, as well as that episode that you recorded with the CEO of AirAsia.
Well, the first episode you ever record is going to be pretty rubbish. It's always going to be a little bit rusty. You'll always look back on it, listen back to it, and you'll sound wooden and not as confident as you are now. It's the same with yourself, Dakshin. You hear yourself improve right over episode to episode. So that's always the case. The first episode, it's there, it's out there for everybody to consume and listen to, so they can all enjoy how bad it really was in the early days. But that's how it is. You've just got to get through it. And then fast forward to sitting with somebody like Tony Fernandez. That was a real pleasure. It was interesting that happened almost by accident. The encounter that I had with him happened completely unplanned. But it led to, firstly, doing a podcast with him, and secondly, doing business with AirAsia, one of our first clients. So I put it to all your listeners, Dakshin, that one of the great advantages of podcasts, because people always ask, how do I monetize a podcast?
Mm.
Well, the real value in a podcast is meeting people like that and being able to do business with them, because you see the podcast as a powerful meeting tool. Look at all the people you can meet. Look at all the conversations you can have as a result of doing a podcast. You couldn't do that just by having a coffee with somebody. You couldn't do that by, having a pitch email or phoning somebody. It just wouldn't work. So that's the real value of a podcast.
Right. And, you've been through the entire evolution of podcast. You've been doing it since then. With respect to the analytics part of it as well, keen on knowing, how was it back then?
No, it didn't exist. It's been if you think about analytics in podcasts, in the early stages, Apple didn't even give you any analytics.
Mm-hmm.
And only when Spotify really in 2017 became a player did we see Apple change and start to produce more analytics. So the whole early 15 years, 17, well, if you think from 2005 to 2017, 12 years, really, we didn't have anything that was meaningful in analytics. So only in the last 4 years have we had anything that we can work with. So it's evolved really fast, and analytics has become a competitive area between Apple and Spotify now.
Right.
So that would be a key point of difference in how they serve their community.
Right. But interesting, because analytics now, also from a monetization and sponsorship point of view, has become a key component when brands or, sponsors ask you with respect to how many listeners do you have, and, what's the completion rate, and all those kind of numbers that they look for. How did it work back then if there was no analytics?
Well, you didn't have that data. That was how it was. People weren't sponsoring podcasts based on analytics.
Mm-hmm.
They were sponsoring podcasts based on they wanted to be in the podcast. That was it. So there were advertisers and sponsors in the early days, but these people were really taking a punt. They were taking a bet on podcasts because they believed in podcasts, and they were effectively aligning their marketing messages with the talking points of the podcast. So this podcast talks about this subject and we talk about that subject, and there's a match. They don't care about the audience.
Right.
So really, that was the early days, and only in the last few years have we professionalized and had something. If you look at there are the directory analytics. So you've got Apple and you've got Spotify, and they've got more robust analytics now. But you also have these third-party tools like Chartable, like Riphonic,
right,
like Podstatus, that give third-party validation tools, which are not all audience-based. So they're more about rankings, SEO, and you have some audience comparatives as well. So the industry has come a long way in the last few years.
And do you enjoy watching the shift, or is it back before the analytics and before the Spotify's and everything else happened? It was very interesting at that point of time, or do you think it's evolving to become much more interesting now?
Yeah, it's more interesting for sure now. We've got 2.7 million podcasts.
Right.
What I like now is that there are podcasts for everybody. So if you're into garden furniture, there's a garden furniture podcast.
Right.
If you're really into it, right? There's a podcast for every single niche, every single audience type. I was listening the other day to a Dungeons and Dragons podcast, a role-playing game podcast. I'm not a role-playing game guy, but I listen to their podcast. And these guys are doing $170,000 a month on sponsorships from donations from their subscribers. And those kind of sums would never been possible 12 years ago.
Yeah.
So what's really happened now is, I call this narrowcasting, which is basically the opposite of broadcasting. So you've got narrowcasting, you have this combination of narrowcasting, data, and also this explosion of content across all these different markets. India is the fastest growing podcast market in the world. 12 years ago, that didn't exist. So that really excites me. You've got these unlocking of voices from all over the world, people telling their stories. And that makes it far more interesting, far more diverse, far more, engaging for different audiences.
Right. Makes sense. Absolutely. Now, just getting into a little more about your process, you also host 4 different shows. Firstly, how do you make time for it? How different are you on all of these 4 shows? And if you script all of them, how do you really tune your mind from show to show?
Well, I'm not hosting 4 shows concurrently. Each show is like a project, and I'll run a show for several months, and then I'll complete that show.
Right.
So my first show, Asia Tech Podcast, did 500 episodes, and I was, satisfied I'd completed that story. It's like a book or an album. You finish it and it's done. You'll go back and replay it or reread it once in a while. But for me, it's done. And similarly, with my shows, I'll only have one running concurrently. So the one I'm doing at the moment is Podcast Maps. And mainly because most of my work is with other clients doing their podcasts. So I'm working on multiple podcasts at any one time, of which I'm only actually speaking on one. And now increasingly speaking on other podcasts like yours, Dakshin, and helping people get onto podcasts, which is where I'm really investing more time in now, because that's a huge growth area. So actually my podcast, in terms of editing time, production time, is probably 5 to 10% of my week now.
Right. Interesting. And, from the shows again, like you mentioned, you did 500 episodes and got done with a particular show. From a listener point of view, of course, they might have had an attachment to that 500 odd episodes that they were keenly listening to. And then you come up with a new show altogether. Is it a conscious decision to actually, and is it fine to keep coming up with new shows once you get completed or done with X number of episodes with another topic? Does that kind of, get your listeners confused about different topics if you have different podcast shows?
It might do, but your listeners aren't always following you. I mean, people do follow people rather than podcasts.
Right.
But you have the opportunity for a new audience. And I think you have to weigh up as well the motivations for doing a podcast. You have intrinsic motivations and you have extrinsic motivations. The intrinsic motivations is you do what pleases you. You do the podcast. It could be a hobby, something you're passionate about. You enjoy talking to people. The extrinsic motivations are business. So how does this help me grow my business? How does it get meetings? How does this get leads, sponsorship, revenue, etc.? So it really depends on why you're doing the podcast. For me, Asia Tech Podcast, I wanted to tell the story of the Asian tech ecosystem. 500 episodes, I felt I achieved my goal. So there was no more I could add, because other people will now, bear in mind, I started that in 2017. So by 2020, there are a lot of people now doing similar podcasts in Asia. Where I was the first, now there were 6 or 7, maybe even 10 in different markets, similar formats. And I felt there was no more I could add. I felt I had started this, and now it is up to other people in different markets to do theirs. So now my next step was to do something else. So I looked at different areas, and for the intrinsic motivations, I wanted to explore artificial intelligence and storytelling, which is 2 areas passionate to me, or I'm passionate about. And so I felt I wanted to do a podcast of that. I did 50 episodes and Be More Human to develop my book, to develop my thoughts, to develop my architecture, to talk to people. And you really need to think about that as a reason why you should do a podcast. Is, you should also think about doing it to develop your thought architecture. Because every time you talk, every time you have to get your ideas out, they crystallize. And it's like being a stand-up comedian. It's practicing and doing the shows, right? Until you get better and better and better. And that's one reason why you should do podcasts and maybe even think about it in that format, like do a show of 50 or 100 or a season even.
Mm-hmm.
It's agile storytelling. And once you have that and done that, you then take the decision, do I continue this to 500? Fine. Or do I start something else? And both are okay, absolutely possible. I don't think it confuses listeners because a lot of people who listen to my stuff will listen to different ones.
Mm.
And the show's not me. The show's not the Graham Brown show. It's about a subject that I want to explore for that year or for 6 months or for 100 episodes.
Right. And just touching upon, the artificial intelligence part of it. The communication gap, of course, is reducing with voice in the age of machines, right? But, podcast and platforms like Spaces, Clubhouse gives a voice. But also, with the growing platforms, we're seeing a lot more of podcasters coming into the play. What's the reason and how is artificial intelligence really influencing this trend?
There's a couple of things there, Dakshin. Firstly, there's the bit about artificial intelligence. And then secondly, there is the part about data and audio. Mm-hmm. Let's have a look at data and audio first and then talk about artificial intelligence. So in the context of data and audio, here's the final frontier of data is audio. If you were to consider a transcript of this podcast now, it may be 5,000, 6,000 words. That's a lot of content.
Right.
If you run that through a simple Amazon Web Services machine learning library like Comprehend or anything that can recognize entities, such as if you mention the word India or Mumbai or mention Amazon or mention Twitter, Facebook, then the machine learning library can pick that up and process 40 minutes of 50 minutes of audio and tell you exactly what these people talked about. Now think about that, because it's very easy to go onto the web and use a writing service, which is semi-machine learning driven, create an article, and it churns out an AI-powered content article for your website, right? It's very easy to do that, very cheap. And a lot of articles are now getting written by machines. And especially with GPT-3 coming, that's going to get worse. What that means is that much of the content on the web is going to be written by machine learning. And yet here we are in audio. This can't be done by AI. There's no way you and I can have this conversation and it can be replicated by a machine.
Yeah.
Absolutely impossible at this level, and not for at least another 10 years. What makes it interesting is we actually, as a species, spend a lot of time talking to each other. And there was a very interesting research program from Stanford University called EAR, E-A-R. And they created this device which sat like a necklace around. You'd wear it, carry it around with you, and every hour it would switch on randomly and take a sample of sound.
Okay.
And the idea was that they wanted to take a sample of speech. What do people normally talk about? And what they found really interesting in this ear project was 40% of our time we are speaking. 40%.
Okay.
Of our waking life we're speaking. Which, if you compare to social media, is significantly more than the time we spend on Twitter or on LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever. It's 10 times more.
Right.
Now, this gets really interesting because it means that a vast majority, almost 90% of everything we communicate with each other is happening off record. It's happening here, now. Two people or more speaking to each other. So you think about that as the final frontier for Facebook, for Twitter, for LinkedIn. All that data is there in audio. So searchable audio will be the next big thing. That is 90% of all the conversations, relationships, connections that we have. Now, the second point about AI, because our world is becoming increasingly driven by machine learning, algorithms, and AI, we as human beings are pushing back the other way. I'm an AI graduate.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm passionate about AI, but I'm also passionate about podcasts. And I believe these two are evolving in parallel. The more we want and demand AI, the more we will seek out real human connection. There is no coincidence that this is the age of authenticity. Everybody's talking about authenticity now.
Mm-hmm.
It's no coincidence about audio. You mentioned Twitter Spaces, you mentioned Clubhouse, you mentioned the growth in podcast. It's because it's real and it's human, and audio is the root of all connections between us all. So these two things are happening at the same time. This massive explosion of machine learning and data. And because of that, we're pushing back the other way and saying, this is my fundamental human nature, to be connected at this level with other humans, not machines.
Mm-hmm.
So the more we push in one way, the more we'll push the other. So I think there's a great future for both of these coexisting.
Right. Oh. Very interesting there. And, I'm keen on knowing from the madness about Clubhouse is just unimaginable. There was in the iOS the surge, and then it dropped in, and then the Android version came in. Now, Clubhouse is equally toxic and less moderated. You now give freedom to people to express, make rooms, and talk whatever they want without being moderated. What's your opinion about a platform and, with this power that a human now has to express whatever using his voice or her voice? How does the future of Clubhouse look to you?
Well, there's a question about Clubhouse, and there's a question generally about social audio.
Mm-hmm.
Clubhouse, I think, as a platform has peaked. We've seen, you look at the data on Google Trends, it seems to have peaked in interest.
Yes.
And it was a victim of its own success. Elon Musk, obviously, had a big impact on that. But then, anything Elon does works. He sold flamethrowers, for God's sake. Remember that? He sold $50 million of flamethrowers. That's the power of his brand.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't really validate what he's selling. So Clubhouse wasn't really validated by him being on it.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore enjoyed a big spike and then dropped off. If you think about this idea of social audio in general, that we can speak openly and freely with each other, this raises a lot of questions about how do you moderate, how do you keep quality.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that with open chat platforms like Omegle or Chat Roulette that became victims of their own success.
Mm-hmm.
They had negative feedback loops. There's even a social scientist phenomenon that they named this, was it the naked hairy man problem?
Mm-hmm.
That the problem with these social platforms is that as the quality degrades, it accelerates. And in the context of these chat platforms, is that you started getting these naked hairy men showing up on the platform, and that scared people away, so it only attracted more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem you've got now with social audio, is a similar naked hairy man problem, which is that you've got extremists. You've got people whose voices aren't normally heard in the mainstream, who gravitate towards social audio, and it's unmoderated. So you get, you will have chat rooms which are borderline racist or discriminatory or hate speech.
Right.
And you can't control these things. So you have that problem existing. Now, how do you control it? Well, I'm not an expert. You have to really look at, how does Reddit work, for example? I think it's the best example. How do you create a self-moderating community rather than, you can't moderate audio at source, right? It's impossible. So you have to self-moderate. And I think Reddit does a pretty good job. So I'd be interested to learn how Reddit would moderate audio. And interestingly, Reddit has plans to launch an audio app.
Yes.
I think it's called Reddit Stage or something.
Right.
So yeah, that would be the key. To maintain quality, it has to be community moderated.
Right. And, integrating, like you mentioned, the social voice or the social audio features with, like you mentioned, Reddit, LinkedIn is also planning in Twitter or, standalone platforms like these, with respect to, say, from an individual, we understand that the moderation and, the freedom of speech and everything exists there. From the marketing side of it, or for marketers today, why is there a need of voice in the world of marketing today?
Well, there always has been voice in marketing. There always has been audio and sound.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of what is audio without video, that's music, isn't it? It's beautiful. It can evoke emotions and feelings and connections. If you have video without audio, that's surveillance. It's a completely different feeling, isn't it? So there always has been audio. Now, the whole point about social audio, why are people looking at audio now? It goes back to the point about authenticity. That increasingly people follow people, not brands. You look at the numbers, it adds up. You have, let's compare LinkedIn on Microsoft's account versus LinkedIn on Satya Nadella's account, right? And, Microsoft's account, 12 million followers, 2 or 3 likes per post. Satya Nadella gets thousands of likes per post because it's him. So that now translates into how we market. People don't follow brands in the same way. They want human experiences. They want real. They want authentic. They want to see the leaders. They want Tony Fernandez, not AirAsia. That's what they want. They want human stories. And now let's think, what is the most human way of communicating with people? I'll say from my example, it's like if I was speaking to my wife, we were having a conversation, or let's say having disagreements, and she would say to me, "Graham, you're not listening." She would never say, "You're not looking at me." And that's core to relationships, isn't it? Listening. When you listen to somebody intently, you connect with them. You feel heard. We have the voice of the customer. We talk about listening to customers, not watching them. And audio is the first experience we ever have of another human. It's when you're in the womb, it's the heartbeat. And that never goes away. Audio is very close. It's the base of all relationships and connections with other people. Even look at the word. That word audio and the word authority and the word audience and the word authentic all come from the same ancient Greek stem, etymological root, which is au. And the full word in ancient Greek, I can't say it because I can't speak ancient Greek, but classical Greek, it means to feel, to perceive. And to answer your question about why brands are looking at audio, because increasingly it's a far more authentic and effective way of communicating with people in a way that people want to be communicated with.
Right. Very interesting. Okay. I'm just going to go back even in terms of from the analytics and algorithm part of the conversation. Graham, one of your conversations says, it highlights a part where you kind of have the hack into understanding the algorithms of podcasting or platforms like Apple and Spotify. A lot of podcasts came into existence and died sooner. But why and what is the science behind the algorithm of these audio platforms? What do they want from us?
Yeah, increasingly, Spotify and Apple are becoming more important in our success as podcast hosts. So you would look at them in the same way, if you were a website owner, the same way you would consider Google. Google obviously isn't the consumer of your website. You are writing it for Dakshin, or you're writing it for Graham, or you're going to write it for your reader. But you would have to design your website with Google in mind, because the ability to tap into the organic traffic that Google has access to is the ability to make or break your website. In the same way, you should now consider what your podcast means to Spotify and Apple, because again, they have the organic traffic that they can send to you, the fire hose of discovery that could make or break your podcast. So what I say to people now is that you should design your podcast with Spotify and Apple in mind. They may not be listening to it, but they have the ability to send you a lot of listeners. So that's really the algorithm part, is once you understand what they're what they're looking for on their platform, it's the same as what Google's looking for. Google processes your site in a specific way. It doesn't look at it like a human being, but it needs to assess it, in the same way Google has PageRank, quality score. These are all factors which help it measure, is this the right search results I'm going to serve to you? Because if you don't get the right search results from Google, guess what? You're going to go somewhere else. So these results have to be quality in the same way Spotify and Apple is increasingly trying to work out what quality is in podcasts so it can deliver quality.
Right.
Obviously, that's relevance, key part of it. If you search for garden furniture, or you search for India, or you search for travel, you're going to get that. But how does it know what is the best travel podcast? Because in the same way, if I type in travel in Google, I'm not going to get the most popular website, am I? I'm going to get the most relevant one. Now, think about that from the algorithm, is that Spotify and Apple is not going to send you, when you type your search in or when you click on another podcast, the most popular podcast, right? It's going to send you a combination of factors: quality, relevance, consistency, ranking, audience size, all these different factors which go into the algorithm. And of course, engagement. Do people actually come back and listen to this podcast? So there are many different factors now that the algorithm's taking into account. And it's becoming harder and harder as a game to rank and to get traffic and to get discovered, in the same way it happened in Google with web traffic as well. If you go back 15 years, it's the same story all over again.
Right. Absolutely. And, just before concluding this round of questions with you, I'm keen on understanding one more thing. You speak about getting your show to 1,000 episodes. That seems quite difficult for a lot of people. From your learnings, of doing so many shows, tell me 3 tips on how one can actually plan for 500 or 1,000 episodes of this.
Yeah, you have to have time and a long-term outlook. I think it's important, right? I mean, how many have you done now, Dakshin?
This is, I'm just completing a year and almost around 70 episodes.
Well, that's amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So 70 would put you in the top 10% of podcasts globally. Most people, as you say at the beginning, don't even get through the beginning.
Right.
Most people fade after a year. So you've got to have a long term. You've got to go, tip 1, you've got to be in it for the long term. Don't start a podcast with the idea that you're going to do 4 or 6. You've got to do it for as long as you want to do it, until the business case for it runs out. So that's the first part. You've got to go in. It's a brand building exercise. It's about building relationships. All of that takes time. The second point then is about the business case. Understand what the factors and the motivations for doing this podcast are. What is the picture of success? Why am I doing this? Are you doing this because you want to meet people? Is it a business development tool for you? Are you doing this to build an audience? Are you doing this for sponsorship? Are you doing this for to sell? Whatever you are, or are you doing this, purely as a branding exercise for your agency or your company? You have to know what the business case for the podcast is, because that will drive everything. As they say, you can't hit a target you don't see. So you have to see the target you're shooting at for your podcast. If you're doing this podcast as a business development tool to meet people, then you should track the metrics of that. How many people did I meet with this podcast? Because it's very easy to do a year or 2 years and get nothing apart from just an interesting exercise. And that's okay. I mean, if you can have a long, sustainable 500 plus episode podcast just because you enjoy it, nothing wrong with that. But then, if you start asking, how do I monetize this? Chances are you're not, because you're 500 in and you haven't even thought about it, right? It's going to be hard to change that.
Right.
So the second tip is know the business case for your podcast and always stay true to that. If the podcast changes or the business case changes, then you might want to think about a different podcast or a new season, right?
Mm-hmm.
The third point and most important point about growing your podcast long term, and the reason why people fail, is growing your audience, because it's getting easier to produce and harder to promote podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
So you must think about how you grow your audience, because unless you grow your audience, your podcast will fail. You know, it's getting harder just to keep it at the same level in terms of audience growth. And growing an audience really means a number of things. The most important and effective way of growing an audience, the two tips within one tip, if you like. The first one is building a community around your podcast. Most people don't. Most people, you have listener questions, Dakshin. That's a great way. Just as a starting point, even small inputs from your community is important.
Right.
In the old days, if you're running a radio show, like, a phone in, that's community building. So one point is build a community. And the second point about growing your audience is cross promotion.
Mm-hmm.
The most effective way of growing an audience is to guest on other podcasts.
Right.
Because guess what? 1 + 1 = 3 in podcast guesting. If you guest on mine and I guest on yours, it works. Like, you bring an audience across.
Right.
And they don't disappear. They stay.
Mm-hmm.
So that last point about growing an audience, community, cross promotion, that will see you to 500.
Right. Absolutely. Great. Amazing answers there. With that, we come to the end of our first round, Graham. Time to move on to a little more fun and candid round. This is the rapid fire round of questions coming right at you. So, ready for this?
No, let's do it.
Okay, then. You have hosted 1,000 episodes and have a great mic, says your bio. Which mic do you have and why do you recommend it?
Shure SM7B. It sounds great. It's also the microphone that Michael Jackson used to use on Thriller, apparently.
Okay. If you ever wanted a co-host for your podcast, apart from me, who else would you consider?
Oh, there's so many. I don't know what would make a good co-host? Somebody who isn't probably as a strong personality as you, because it would be too competitive. I would like to have Tony Fernandez for a few, just for a good jam. Who else would I have on there? Somebody who has to be probably really funny.
Yeah.
A comedian. Because otherwise, I'm quite serious. It needs to be funny. So suggest a comedian. Who would make a good comedian? I don't know. Kevin Hart. He seems to do well as a co-host with The Rock.
Yeah.
That's a random one. I don't know why I came up with that.
Okay. Audio is like what blogs used to be a few years ago. When someone says this to you, how would you react?
Yeah, I'd say audio is like websites. Yeah, definitely. That's very true. There were 2.7 million websites today in 1990. Sorry, 2.7 million podcasts today. In 1997, there were 2.7 million websites. How many websites are there today? 1.8 billion, I think. So yeah, it is pretty accurate. I'd say websites rather than blogs.
Okay. Is it necessary to have a good voice for an audio communication?
It helps, but it's not necessary.
Okay. If you aren't integrating audio in your business yet, you're missing out on, complete the sentence.
On audio. You're missing out on authentic communication and giving your leaders a voice, unlocking the human potential inside your brand. There's so many conversations inside your brand, whether it's the CEO or the, whoever it may be, the intern. There are conversations which are just locked away. That's what you're missing out on, unlocking all of that. Like Airbnb did for accommodation. You could do that for all this kind of underutilized assets inside your business.
Right. Okay. If tomorrow Twitter Spaces and Clubhouse started ad opportunities for brands and creators, how would you react?
Yeah, I'm sure they're going to. I wouldn't be surprised. It would be a good thing that they have the reach, help grow and improve some of the analytics and audio.
Okay. And your favorite audio shows are?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, I'm obviously a fan of Joe Rogan Experience because it's been around since forever. I've started listening to the Dungeons and Daddies podcast because it makes me laugh.
Mm-hmm.
I've got so many good ones. The Real Dictators, I think, is fantastic by Noiser because the production is so good. And I'm also starting to listen to apps like Curio, which are audio journalism, which I think are fantastic.
Okay. And finally, what's next for Graham to look forward to this year?
I'm focusing a lot on podcast guesting for other people now, and it's working out really well.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that a lot of people in business wanted to start a podcast, but they didn't, or they enjoyed podcasts. They were really passionate about podcasts, but actually doing one themselves was a lot of work. So for every one person who starts a podcast, there's like 20 plus who are passionate about them. So I wanted to serve that group of people. And that's what I'm doing now, helping those guys get out there. And it's been a lot of fun.
Right. Amazing stuff there, Graham. That concludes our second round. Very well performed there.
Thank you.
And time for the third and last round. And this is a question we take from one of our listeners. And this question is from Garima Vaz, who asks, I'm a professional HR consultant, and considering the global scenario of employment, I want to use audio as a medium to help people. It's like creating a partial LinkedIn, but in audio format. How can one best use a medium like Twitter Spaces or Clubhouse to create a professional network, help each other with tips, employment opportunities, and mentorship programs? How does one start this, and what is required for this?
Yeah, this is a really good question, Garima. I would look at audio as your new water cooler. So a big part of any business is the places we meet and have informal conversations. Mm-hmm. And that's what really creates culture. Culture is conversation. And, really, HR really needs to evolve from being a gatekeeper to an enabler within these organizations. So how can HR be less about, it has its function in mitigating risk, hiring people, and policy and process, to more focusing on how can it enable conversations inside the organization and help create a culture, help create a brand experience that comes out of that culture. You're talking about training, you're talking about internal conversations that then reflects in external brand experience. We experience the brand through its people, and that experience is how they interact with us. Take the airline as an example. The brand of that airline isn't a logo or a song or an actor. The brand is how I experience the cabin crew or the ground staff, how they deal with me. Mm-hmm. And that comes from the internal training and processes. So if we start with that assumption that this is all about creating culture and a brand and internal conversations, then audio is a fantastic way of doing it. Twitter and Clubhouse, I feel, are one option, but you would probably be better creating a podcast internally and sharing those conversations on an internal basis. You could fundamentally, because Twitter and Clubhouse, once it's done, it's lost. And I feel a big part of what HR does and a big part of what we do internally with documenting culture and capturing it, whether it's best practices or examples, is that not everybody is there at that time. There's a great idea in HR to catch somebody doing something right. Mm-hmm. So this person in this department was doing this really interesting thing. It's a case study, right? That needs to be captured and then exemplified for the whole organization. Look at what they're doing in the IT department. Look at what they're doing in social. Look at, and people can learn about each other. And the problem with Twitter and Clubhouse is you can't capture it. It's done as a webinar or it's done as a one-off and it's gone. What you want is to capture that forever. If I join 2 years later, I can't go back 2 years and listen to that Twitter hangout that you had. But I can listen to that example of what that intern did in IT. And I feel that's really where you're documenting and capturing all the best of your organization internally, I would really consider looking at internal podcasts. Companies are doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a fantastic idea. It's very progressive, and you could do this in a very low risk way. And we've certainly worked with companies in doing it in different ways. And I think it's a great way for HR to really become an enabler. As I said, just being the gatekeeper within the organization.
Right. Absolutely. Wonderful. Right. And that brings us to the end of today's show. Thank you so much, Graham, for sharing the opportunities that audio brings into one's life. I had a great time hosting you, and I hope you had your share of good time too.
It was a lot of fun. You're a good host, Dakshin.
Thank you so much, and I wish you and all your ventures and gigs all the very best for this year.
Thank you.
So, are you on Clubhouse? Or are you in love with audio, or you absolutely hate it? Share your thoughts along with any question that you have on today's episode at thedeliberate.talks@gmail.com, or connect with me on the social media channels and the audio platforms. Join in next Monday for another episode with another guest. And until then, please take care of yourself and don't forget to inspire and be inspired.